Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Unpacking Social Dynamics, a guide to strengthening your workplace safety culture. My name is Cassie Bolter, and I'm the Events and Partnership Manager at Centus. Today's presenters are Head of Client Solutions, Ben Carnell. Ben leads the business function responsible for overseeing Centus's client partnerships. An experienced psychologist, he brings a strong background in performance psychology and offers expertise in cultural diagnostics, strategy development, and program facilitation and leadership coaching to drive individual, team, and organisational improvement. Joining Ben today, we have Dr. Amy Hawkes. Unfortunately, Adriana, who was meant to be presenting with Ben today, couldn't make it. So we've got the lovely Amy stepping in for us. And Amy is the head of psychology at Centus. Amy brings best practice insights to business, strong statistical skills and applied research methodology to her work. Amy leads the research team and provides strategic guidance to the assessment tools and reporting offered by Centus. Thanks again for joining us today, and I'll now pass over to Ben and Amy.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Cassie, and good to have everyone on the call today. Looking really forward to today's webinar and the topic that we're going to go through. We've got a fair bit that we are going to try and cover off on today, and we'll do our best to get through as much of that as we can. There we are. Wonderful. Before we do start, we do just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians throughout Australia, and we recognise, we've got some international participants in today's webinar as well, and we recognise their connections to land, waters, and community. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we all meet today, and pay our respects to elders past and present. We do extend that to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. We do this because we value the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, culture, and knowledge as well. For those that aren't familiar with Centus, and Cassie has just introduced myself and Amy there. We've both been with Centus for quite a while now. But Centus, for those that aren't familiar, we're an organisation management consulting company that supports organisations to work through complex safety challenges. Often those are safety cultural challenges, but extends into safety leadership, psychosocial safety, critical risk, and all the elements that make up creating a strong performance culture, safety performance culture within organisations as well. This is our mission as an organisation, and if you haven't seen one of our webinars before, you'll see this sort of imagery come through in what we do and what we talk about. Because really our approach to safety is that we like the result that we get from safety, and safety is about protecting us for something, not necessarily from something because we have to do it. We like the result for these exact moments that you see on the screen just here as well. By means of an agenda today, I said that we've got a fair bit we are going to try and get through today, so we'll do our best to get through as much of that as possible. In terms of our of an agenda, and it just looks like the slides are just moving a little bit slowly. They're still working up. We're going to go through some, we're in a fortunate position and headed up by Amy and her team. We've got a lot of diagnostic data, and we've spent quite a bit of time over the last little while pulling out some insights from that data to talk about the experience of safety. So we're going to jump into that a bit today. We're going to talk about, in particular, the social experience of safety, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But some really good insights, in particular, in the social experience of safety. We're then going to jump into some of the opportunity areas, and there's 3 opportunity areas that we're going to touch on in particular as well. What I want to talk to everyone about first is what we call positive safety. And again, for those of you that have jumped on a Centus webinar before, or recently, certainly, you would have heard around this notion of positive safety, and it's a conversation that we're having with a lot of organisations at the moment, inviting organisations to actually think about, well, where to in the next safety journey in terms of where organisations are heading. What we're inviting organisations to look at in this notion around positive safety is, for a long time, and it depends on the industry, but for a long time, safety has been focused on the avoidance of things or the absence of things, which is a challenging thing, and I think has made the safety space quite a complex landscape, because to measure the presence of something by the absence of something has its restrictions. What we're inviting organisations to look at is to actually cultivate or create the sort of environment, the culture, the workplace, we're actually looking at what are the things that we do want to see within our particular workplace that tell us that people are having a safe and a positive experience at work. In particular, what we're inviting organisations to look at is the experience of work for people. And so often we can get caught up in different terminologies and those sorts of things. And what we invite leaders in particular and yourselves on the call today is to look at what is the experience like for people when they step into the workplace, and to look at that through three different integrated lenses. The first one is what we call the physical experience. And this is looking at things like the work environment, equipment, the physical environment, and that the impact that can have on individuals' well-being, both from a physical well-being as well as a broader well-being perspective as well. And then we're inviting organisations to look at the psychological experience of work. So what sort of environment are people operating in, and what sort of impact or experiences that create for their mental and their psychological well-being. But then we're also inviting organisations to look at the social experience of work. And the social experience of work, which we're going to spend some time touching on today, is looking at what are all those interactions that happen between people, across teams, within teams, across levels, that has either a positive or a negative impact on what the experience of work is like for people. What we're seeing for organisations is that they really need to consider all three of these integrated areas well if they're to get up to what we would call a citizenship type culture. The challenge for a lot of organisations, or certainly the conversations that we're seeing, is that generally the physical experience has been a strong focus for a long time. And when we think about typical safety, or the word sort of safety springs to mind, or you put safety in Google Images, you'll see things that relate to the physical experience of safety. More recently, with the shift in psychosocial landscape across different countries, but likewise, probably over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, we've seen that greater focus on mental health and well-being, and that taps into the psychological experience of what work looks like. The opportunity exists, though. The challenge that we've probably seen is that both of those things are often treated quite separately. And the perfect example of this is you might be talking to a GM of health and safety at a particular organisation, and once you start to talk about mental well-being or psychological health and safety, is very quickly HR's brought into the conversation. And so these two things are treated or approached or looked after, supported by different parts of the organisation, often not in an integrated way. And I think that highlights the growth that organisations have seen, but also the key opportunity that exists is looking at what does it look like to bring those things together. The opportunity in bringing those things together is to look at the social experience of what work is like. Is that work is a very social environment. What is that like for people when they come to work, in terms of the interactions that they are having with people as well? You'll notice in this model, the safety experience model, is that psychological and social are treated as separate things to consider. Of course, though, they are integrated within the psychosocial aspect of work as well. One of the things I mentioned that we've looked at in the last little while is we're in a very fortunate position that we've got a lot of diagnostic data from working with a lot of different organisations. And what we've looked at over the last little while is looked at what are the perceptions of safety across different levels of organisations, when we try and understand what the experience of work is like for people. And what we've used our diagnostic tools to look at is, well, what does that look like across each of these three different areas: the physical experience of work, the psychological experience of work, and the social experience of work, just as much as well. And so this report, and you can add your name to the list. This report will come out very shortly. But what we've used is our safety climate survey, and our safety climate survey. Climate, for those not familiar, is looking at really sort of the high level of culture, or looking at culture at a point in time. And we've used that tool, which collects a lot of quantitative data, to really extract those insights around those three experiences of safety, and how they interrelate and how they work together to support one another as well. So today, what we're going to go through is actually some of the insights that have come out of this report, which will be released very shortly. To jump into that in a little bit more detail, this is the data that's within the report. So we're looking at data from over 59,000 respondents that have participated through their organisation in our safety climate survey, and looked in particular at their perceptions of what the experience of safety is like in their respective organisation. In particular, this tool is looking at people's perceptions, a conversation we often have with executives and we have with boards, and a common question that we'll get is, well, that's just people's perceptions. Absolutely it is, and rightly or wrongly, it's their perceptions, and their perception will be reality. And so the opportunity for organisations when we go through a tool like this is to look at, what do we need to do differently? Or if we do think we are doing it differently, what do we need to do in terms of shifting people's perceptions and the experiences that they're having in their workplace as well. You can see, that all up, we're looking at a sample of around about the 30,000 mark as well. So we've stratified that to make sure that no particular data set is skewing that data. We're looking at data across a range of different countries, from Australia and New Zealand in particular, but we do a lot of work with organisations around the world, particularly North America, and likewise across in Africa and the Middle East as well. A range of different industries, utilities, mining and agriculture are some of the bigger industries that we've worked with, but you can see a range of industries there, and a lot of organisations, 75 organisations all up as well. And likewise, quite a representative sample across different levels of an organisation, as well as industry tenure and likewise age as well. So for Amy and myself, who we're probably data nerds, if we can throw ourselves into that categories, we love looking at this sort of data, because this is a heap of data that we're able to answer questions when we talk to organisations around, what are you finding across this country or across this industry or across what's happening across other organisations. Is we can speak anecdotally to that, but the best insight into that is looking at what data is actually telling us as well. So to jump into this in a little bit more detail here, is what we jumped into specifically is looking at the social experience of work. And the reason why we've jumped into this, there's a couple of reasons. One is that the social experience of work and the dimensions that contribute to the social experience has such a significant impact on what the physical experience is and what the psychological experience is as well. So if I'm to paint some examples just to flesh that out in a little bit more detail, is that if we want to increase reporting in an organisation, and we can put the right systems in place, we can have the right communication around it, we can be positioned well. If there's an element of distrust that exists between the workforce and leaders, that's the social experience. It doesn't matter really what you do in the reporting space until that trust, that social experience is shifted. The reporting culture is not going to shift. Likewise, if we want to talk about, people, let's say we look more at sort of psychological health and safety, and we look at the experience of work in terms of people being able to respond to challenges as things sort of ramp up, and the resilience that they've got, and likewise that they're supported with to respond to those challenges in high work demands. To be able to respond to that and to be able to meet those challenges requires having a strong trust, requires that psychological safety, to use Amy Edmondson's term, where people can have conversations and support each other around those high work demands. If you haven't got that sort of trust that exists, or that sort of social interaction that exists between people, people being able to respond to those high work demands or low work demands to that point as well is not going to work without that social experience being considered in the mix there as well. The other part, and the other reason why we're going to touch on this, is one, some of the greater strength, or some of the more significant strengths and opportunities popped out in the social experience. But it's also, and to my examples earlier on before, it's such a key area that we find organisations have got the opportunity to shift, and that shifting the social experience is one of the things that will shift the other experiences of safety just as much as well. I'm going to show a short video here, which I think taps into some of the underlying considerations and the underlying science around the social experience, what it is, but also why it's really important to consider when we're looking at shifting the broader safety experience for people as well.
Humans are social beings that thrive when working in groups. Throughout history, we have enhanced our chances of survival by collectively sharing things such as resources, knowledge, and workloads. Alternatively, isolation or rejection from a group could have decreased our survival chances. As a result, our brain is highly aware of our ongoing social status and possible threats or rewards to this. Today, the workplace is one of the biggest social environments the brain experiences. Our brain is constantly providing us with feedback on our social interactions with others. We need to know when things are working in our favor or when our social situation may be under threat. Our brain interprets our social interactions through the use of neural pathways and chemical messages commonly used for pleasure and pain. For example, when our brain recognizes potential rewards from a social interaction, it releases chemicals along the same neural pathways associated with pleasure, making us feel physically good. When we feel threatened, rejected, or taken advantage of, the same pathways that tell us we are in physical pain are activated. Our brains don't always operate in isolation to one another. We often trigger a threat or reward response to the people around us. We may not even realize we are doing this. So the next time you interact with someone at work, consider what social messages you may be sending and the impact you may be having on their brain.
If we could just go back one slide, thanks, Amy. My eagerness clicking through there is we're incredibly social creatures, and that won't be a surprise to many people on the call here. This dates back to very primitive times in terms of how we operated as humans. Is we as humans learnt very, very quickly that in order to survive, and we're going back to very primitive times here, in order to survive, we needed to operate as a group. In terms of going back to hunter and gather type times, is that we needed to operate in a group environment. Where we weren't operating in a group environment is that what our brain would realize is that actually there's a threat to our survival here, and that becomes a very stressful situation. So what that looks like is we go back to primitive times, and we've got to hunt down an animal in order to feed the village or whatever it might be that we're operating in. In order for us to hunt down that animal, we learned that operating in a group environment was the best way to do that. We're hunting down the mammoth or whatever it might be. A group environment, a group team to achieve that is going to help us get there. But likewise, if that mammoth or whatever the animal was turned around and started chasing us, our best chance of survival was in a group setting. And so right back to primitive times, and that's then continued on to how we go about functioning today just as a society, is that we get stuff done as a group. Even individual tasks, there's a group contribution that has a role to play in that. And so our brains over a long time have really started to look at this in terms of, we look at what are the things that tell us that we're part of the group, and or part of a group, and what are the things that tell us that we're not part of a group. And these sorts of things can be both rewarding or they can be threatening in terms of what our survival is likely to look like as well. The challenge within this is that our environment has changed quite significantly. We're not hunting down animals or mammoths. We're not sort of having to protect ourselves from animals out there in the wild so much anymore. But we're still operating in this very social environment, and this far more complex social environment. But our brain is still operating off that same mechanism, very advanced mechanism, but it's now operating in a more complex and a different environment. The brain in itself looks at what are those things that tell me that I'm part of a group, and what are those things that tell me that I'm not part of a group. And we start to look at this in terms of the psychosocial space, in terms of looking at some of those factors that may fill our bucket, and some of those things that may drain our bucket, and some of those psychosocial hazards that we may be exposed to on a day-to-day basis. This is looking like not having clarity in our role, or not having support from a leader, or having high work demands, or having low work demands, having high autonomy, having low autonomy. All these sorts of things trigger the social brain, because subconsciously they're telling our brain we're either part of the group or we're not part of the group. If I'm to take, for example, support from a leader, is that if I don't feel that I've got support from a leader, that is a very threatening experience for my social brain to go through, because my brain is going, maybe I'm not part of the group here. On the flip side, if I am getting supported very much by my leader or by my team or whoever it might be, that triggers a reward response in the social brain, and we start to feel part of the group. I mentioned before that our brains haven't evolved too much for a long period of time, as advanced as they are. And what actually happens in the brain is that the same neural pathways are triggered when our social brain, when that threat response is triggered, as it would be if we're exposed to a physical threat. So what I mean by that is that if someone was to ignore our efforts or to not include us in a particular task or project that we might be working on, and then we experience that will trigger the threat response within our social brain. But it's the exact same neural pathways that are activated if we were to be out there in the wilderness and we come across a lion or we come across a snake or something to that effect. So the brain is actually not very good at working out what is a real threat and what is a perceived threat. The threat response just kicks in. Naturally, as you're exposed to a physical threat, as might be the case with a social threat, is that stress response starts to kick in more and more the more threats that we're exposed to. With a lion or a snake, it goes right to maximum pretty quickly, but as the social threat gets triggered, that starts to accumulate where our stress response will then kick in. This is where we start to see the impact on people's mental health and well-being and their psychological well-being as well start to be significantly impacted. The opportunity is, how do we as an organization, how do we as leaders actually start to be consciously trying to trigger the reward response in people's brains? And these can be some of the big things, which we'll touch on. Likewise, they can be some of the smaller things in terms of reaching out to offer support to someone. That is telling that person's social brain, in obviously not an overt way, but it's telling that person's social brain that, hey, you're part of the group here. We've got you. You're part of a team here. Far less stressful environment for that person to be operating in as well. So when we jump into the results, the interesting thing, and I mentioned it before, is that the social experience of safety, we saw that had both some of the higher positives when we look right across safety climate, but that it also had some of the most negative perceptions that existed as well. So let's jump into some of those positives. The first one is one of the strengths that came through right across that data set is a belief that people feel supported by their team. Is that safety is everyone's duty to maintain, the people there to look out for each other and support one another. So within their team, people feel really, really well supported. They know that person there that I'm working alongside, I feel that person knows that safety is their responsibility. I also feel that person there is going to be looking out for each other's safety as well. Likewise, we start to see that extend into what the supervisor relationships look like. So one of the strengths that comes through, and this often comes through in the diagnostics we conduct, is people have really good relationships with their direct supervisor, so the person that they report to, and feel that supervisor is looking out for their safety as well. But also that they can talk to that supervisor or their leader about safety or wellbeing concerns. And certainly we're seeing this shift more and more in the wellbeing space when we talk about psychological health and safety, is that people can talk to their supervisor around physical safety concerns, that they don't feel the environment is safe in where they might be operating. But likewise, and particularly relevant for those that might be more in a office type environment, is that people are able to have conversations with their leader, or feel they're more able to have the conversations with their leader about how their own wellbeing and mental health might be going as well. So what we're doing well, we're seeing those strengths from the social experience come through at a team level. So the things that individuals, the things that teams are doing, is working really well in the social experience, of safety. Is that there's something that teams, there's something that individuals, and I would also say that the supervisors and the leaders of those teams are doing to foster that safe, positive social experience of what safety looks like within their teams. On the flip side, is we see some opportunities that also exist in the social experience of safety. The first one we're looking at is how mistakes are managed, particularly during high risk activities, and we see that mistakes are often not managed well. Likewise, we see that people don't feel that they have the opportunity to contribute to organisational decisions. We also see that people don't feel that doing the right thing or that safe behaviour is recognised and rewarded. People often feel that safety only gets spoken about, or wellbeing only gets spoken about when something goes wrong, that we're not actually acknowledging the good. And people don't feel that change communication or that change is necessarily implemented well as well. So these are the four areas that came in the last when we look at that social experience of safety. What's interesting about these ones and really stood out for us is that all of these areas actually relate to the organisational level. Is that different from the strengths areas, which are very individual and team oriented? These are the things that actually need to be shifted and actually need to be targeted at a systematic level. So many interventions and so many things we see organisations doing target the individual, target the team level, which is great. But we really need to be looking at what needs to happen at a systematic level if we are to really facilitate that shift in what the social experience of safety looks like. We're going to unpack each of these three in turn. I'm going to hand over to Amy, who's going to take us through the first one.
Lovely. Thanks, Ben. The first one that we thought was worth spending a bit of time talking about today is the reward and recognition component. And as Ben's explained about the social brain and the various threats and rewards that we can perceive in our environment. So when we perceive something as positive, our brain is going to release that oxytocin and the dopamine. That's two feel-good chemicals that help reinforce our interest in what's going on around us, around people around us, help us feel connected. And that ensures that we're likely to return and repeat those behaviours. So that's the power that sits behind really good reward and recognition. Interestingly, some of our research with safety leadership is demonstrating that safety leaders are not always able or confident to do that reward and recognition part of their role. And their employees are also perceiving that that is the area that they're not stepping up enough in, they're not feeling supported enough in. So it's absolutely an area that our safety leaders can be thinking about more. And I think leaders in general can be thinking about more. It's also really interesting at this point to think about how reward and recognition programs can support our sense of satisfaction and our sense of motivation. So we know that there are some basic elements of a work environment that we need to get right for people to feel motivated and for people to feel satisfied in their work. And that's things like basic fair working conditions, fair remuneration for a day's work, having a clear role description. So these are termed hygiene factors by Frederick Hertzberg in his early motivation theory. And that's because these are the basics that we need to get right before we can start to build motivation to a higher level. So I'd really encourage you to spend a moment to think about what's going on in your workplace. And do we have these hygiene factors right before we start adding on reward and recognition programs? Because if we don't have the basics right, these reward and recognition programs aren't going to get off the ground the way we really want them to. If we feel we've got our basics right, then we can really start to think about those higher order factors. So those motivating factors, that's where people feel connected to the workplace, to the values. They feel that their work they're doing is meaningful and useful. And they also feel, as Ben was talking about before, that sense of connection and support from the people around them. And that's one of the things that's really interesting to see in that social side of the safety experience, and the fact that that team and direct supervisor is meeting some of those needs at the moment. At this point, we'd love to pause and get some feedback from you all on how you see reward and recognition programs working in your organization. So Cassie's popped up a poll on the screen for you there. If you click on the one that you think best represents how your organization recognizes and rewards safe behavior, it could be not well at all. So perhaps it's only recognized based on performance targets. Could be not great, but people are trying. It just doesn't happen consistently. It's on its way. They have you've got processes in place, but the business doesn't seem to engage with it. Could be fairly well done in your organization. Leaders are regularly recognizing workers for safe behavior, or potentially you're doing really well. So leaders to workers, peer-to-peer, cross-team safety recognition is all occurring regularly. So I'll give you a second to pop your answer in there while the poll's open. I'm really curious to see how you think things are working in your organization in this area. How are we going, Cassie?
Yep, I will close it down now.
Thanks. Fantastic. That's great. Okay, so we've got 16% sitting at not well at all, about 20% sitting at not great, and 31% sitting at we are trying. So more than half are sitting in that not doing quite as well as we'd like, but on our way. And 29% sitting at fairly well and only 4% doing really well. So we need to learn more from those 4%ers at the top, hey? Any thoughts on that one, Ben?
Yeah, I think the thing that jumped out for me is, yeah, there's more probably in the first two than what I was anticipating, which is good. It's good that we're acknowledging that as well. Yeah, but yeah, there's always, it's one of those things that's never a destination you get to and it's done. It's always something you're evolving in this space as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Very true. And that's the other interesting thing about this. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all model for every individual either. There's going to be some individuals that are not going to enjoy being called out in a public forum for a moment of recognition, and it's actually potentially quite socially threatening for that individual. So as a leader, we need to be thinking about the individuals in our team and how we might be able to adapt our various different options for recognizing positive performance and positive behavior. It's an area where we can do some more. Cool. I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about how our brain works, and why this reward and recognition is important, and how we need to feel that we're being heard, that we're being seen, and that we're being valued in our day-to-day work. And it connects really well with that social brain response and what we know from self-determination theory in terms of some of those key drivers behind people's choices and internal motivations, the reward and recognition that helps build that sense of relatedness, that sense of connection with others. And it also helps build your sense of competence, so your sense of confidence in your ability to be doing work well and doing work properly. And that feedback is really important for continuing in our working day. So it's a really good ongoing way of showing appreciation and affirming those positive effects and of workers on a day-to-day, showing that gratitude is really motivating to people. And workers who are feeling appreciated are more positive about themselves and their ability to contribute. They feel more satisfied. They're more willing to help others and solve problems more creatively. So overall, there's lots of really good benefits from working in this space and trying to think about how we can reward and recognize our people better. So some of those other benefits on top of good reward and recognition include some performance improvements and a stronger culture and cultivating that sense of belongingness. And it really makes sense to us, you know, with our psychology backgrounds, that having that sense of connection, that sense of belongingness, that sense of being part of a team, part of our social circle, really helps us feel satisfied and motivated in our day-to-day work. And this is really important part of what we can do to recognize and improve the day-to-day work experience and reduce people's experience of stress as well. So we know that reward and recognition, support from our leaders, support from our team, are job resources that help us deal with some of the stressors that might come up on a day-to-day basis as well. So if we know that there's lots of good positive things about good reward and recognition programs, why do we have so many organizations, and we saw it in our poll, that are just feeling like they're not quite hitting the mark and not doing it as well as they could? So what are some of the things that organizations are not setting up to the best extent possible? One of the main reasons here is that there's often no buy-in. So sometimes these reward and recognition programs can come a bit out of the blue. The leaders that are meant to implement them, they don't fully understand it, or they don't think it's necessary, they don't think it's important, and therefore they don't use it. So people hear about these programs that might exist in the background, but they don't actually see them being implemented. And that's because there might be a lack of buy-in. In some more negative safety culture environments, we might even see people who will make fun of these reward and recognition programs, you know, who will sort of have a bit of a joke about them. And that's, again, going to undermine the potential for these programs to achieve what we're trying to achieve. Another issue is if the rewards are too infrequent. So this is where, you know, if you feel like you're working really well, you feel like you're demonstrating the behavior that people are looking for, but you're only getting recognized, let's say, once a year, it's not going to be sufficient to actually reward and encourage that behavior. On the flip side of that, we can actually completely undermine our reward system if we're overusing them. So it's a fine line that organizations are walking here to ensure that we're calling out good behavior when we see it, and that we're not making it seem cheap because it happens all the time. Right. The third thing that organizations tend to get wrong with good reward and recognition programs is they have an over-reliance on tangible rewards. So these are sort of perhaps more physical rewards, like a gift voucher or something like that, that can create that expectation of a reward. So you don't want employees to only display behaviors that you're looking for when they feel they're being watched by the person who has the gift card or the voucher to give, or potentially that people are feeling like the reward isn't really what they're looking for either. There's an interesting piece of research in the social psychology space that looks at helping behavior and what happens when somebody is rewarded after helping. And often people help for that intrinsic sense of social connection, not because they're seeking a reward or a gift card at the end of it. So by giving that reward, we can actually change the way the person feels about that helping process. It changes the motivation from being something that's quite internal to something that's potentially a bit more external. So it's something for an organization to think about and navigate. How can you call out those positive moments and contributions with public messages of thanks, with storytelling, with moments of conversation, so that it's not just about, hey, here's something physical as a tangible kind of reward. It's something that's talked about as a story, as reason for being there, and something that's positive about a moment in time, so that it's not just about getting the gift card at the end of the day. The next issue that we see is organizations not making it meaningful. So if you're just saying, great job team, at the end of every day, people might start out going, oh, yeah, that was really nice. But after a couple of weeks, a couple of months, that's really going to lose some of its meaning and some of its importance to people. And so that effective recognition really needs to be focused on something specific and delivered in a way that really clearly identifies what the employee has done well. Last issue, I know there's a long list of issues that organizations are getting wrong in this reward and recognition space, but the last one is that they're not being equitable. So if we're giving rewards that can't be accessed by all the relevant employees, then this is actually likely to trigger that threat response, that sense of being excluded from that reward. So something that you might hear about could be a special lunch or a special barbecue as a reward for a really great quarter, but it's at a time of the day when remote or shift workers can't attend, and there's nothing else that's offered at an alternate time or at an alternate site or something like that that recognizes the full team effort that went into achieving that result. And that's where people can then feel a bit excluded from that process. So there's a lot for organizations to be thinking about. There's a lot that organizations can be doing to improve their reward and recognition processes. And it's really about more than just monetary rewards. We really need to start thinking a bit more creatively about how we can recognize our people, connect to that purpose, connect to that sense of team, the sense of meaning, the sense of learning and innovating and sharing those solutions and being creative. And that really helps, you know, build that employee value proposition that goes beyond just a pay compensation kind of reward. Lovely. So some top tips that I've sort of touched on a few of these already, but it's a quick summary before we move on to our next topic. So there are a few things we can do well to create a culture that recognizes and rewards our positive behaviors that we're looking for. So we want to be recognizing people frequently, making sure that it doesn't become an expectation. We want to link recognition to specific actions and behaviors, ensure that safety is rewarded similarly to production, quality, and efficiency. So if you've got KPIs for some of those things, how is that being played off against your safety expectations? Help people identify positive safety behaviours by linking them back to those organisational values. Reconsider the use of financial incentives that might be linked to your KPIs, and support and encourage peer-to-peer recognition, both within teams and across teams. And consider what will motivate your people: access to your CEO, potentially, development opportunities, could be time off work, could be better parking. We've heard of one organisation that does that. It could be gift vouchers or tickets to events. Again, pairing some of those tangible rewards with the recognition and the storytelling and the conversation about what it was that this person has done well to really help connect to that sense of meaning and purpose. Is some of the tips that we've got. If people have sat and listened through that set of reward and recognitions and it's prompted some additional examples or ideas, we would love to see them in the chat and hear about what's working well for you as well. And we're going to come back to some of the chat comments and question comments towards the end. Ben, I'll throw over to you.
Yeah, I think at that point I can see some of the comments coming through as well. Is it's really people can sometimes overcomplicate reward and recognition. They become too restrictive. It's one of those things that you just got to just do as part of PAU, for want of a better term, and that particularly applies to leaders as well. And so one of the comments there, sort of touching on it, Amy was talking to, is attributing that to not necessarily, or certainly not just the outcome, but actually what it was that the person did to help get that outcome. So rewarding that part, sometimes irrespective of what the outcome might be, particularly if that is a demonstration of the value or what the sort of safety culture that you are trying to create as well. So being able to use attributions for those familiar with that leadership tool to actually utilize or communicate that recognition in terms of how it's been anchored to something as well. The other part that we often talk about when we talk about reward and recognition is no one ever left an organisation for feeling overvalued. And I say that with some jest, but also some seriousness as well. Is that people generally leave an organisation because they don't feel valued. I think particularly those that are on the safety journey and don't feel that that's being recognised. At best case scenario, they'll disengage with with the safety journey that you're on. That's best case scenario. So that's an invitation for everyone. In the next area, what we're looking at is how we manage mistakes and how we manage errors. And this is another area that organisations often get wrong or don't get right consistently, is probably the best way to term it here. So often what we see is that you look at when mistakes, and they can be some of the smaller mistakes, the day-to-day things, that pop up. Those things will happen if you've got humans in your organisation, but also some of the bigger things, particularly if we're doing high-risk tasks and there is unfortunately an incident, what does that post-incident review process look like? Is it there to find out who did the wrong thing and where, and by where I mean the who in terms of things fell down, or is it there to actually go, hey, there was an outcome here that has significant impact on people or a person, not the desired outcome, but how do we make sure that doesn't happen again? It is very much framed as that learning opportunity. The next thing to consider is how often we actually talk about mistakes. Is do we actually create a culture where people are comfortable being vulnerable and comfortable saying, hey, I got this wrong, or hey, we made this mistake here. And that may be irrespective of the outcome. The outcome that could happen might not have happened, but are people going, hey, we did this and I got this part wrong, I just want to flag it so it doesn't happen again, and then could lead to that outcome potentially happening as well. Do people feel comfortable to discuss those mistakes just on a day-to-day basis as well? And then how well does the organisation move from that mistake to quickly looking at sharing those lessons learned as well? And I think this is an area that organisations can do a lot better in, because often those lessons are disseminated and it'll be an email that will get lost in everyone's inbox, or it'll be an A4 page that's printed and put up on the board in the crib room or an office, something to that effect. Is how well are we actually taking the opportunity to say, hey, this happened, here's what we learned from it, and then facilitating that conversation around how do we make sure it doesn't happen again as well. This one's quite an interesting area, because what Amy touched on in her section there is looking at what are the things that trigger the reward response, and the absence of which is obviously not what we're trying to chase. But here we're looking at what are those things that not just don't trigger the reward, but actually trigger the threat response within the social brain as well. The reason why we see that mistakes are quite a threatening experience for an individual's social brain, and we can see, and for those that have made a mistake before, I'm sure there's some of us on the call. I'm sure there's some on the call that have never made a mistake before as well, or would say so. But when we talk about making mistakes, of which we've all made, I'm joking, of course. It's a stressful situation for our brain to go in. Adrenaline kicks in, cortisol kicks in. No different to being exposed from a brain perspective to being exposed to that snake or that line that may come across our pathway. And so what that will do is it will start to fuel particular thoughts within our brain around, well, I don't want to own up to that mistake because that's going to put me in a lower social standing, or it's going to potentially compromise my position in the group. I'm going to look stupid, or I'm going to look incompetent. I'm worried about what the response might be from others, that my leader's going to, have a go at me, or that others in my team are going to have a go at me. I may be ridiculed by my team members, even if in a banter way, in a way that isn't, that isn't necessarily, harsh in terms of what that banter might look like. But I'm worried about being on the receiving end of that, even to more, or more some of those extreme experiences of, people losing their job as a result of owning up to mistake, or, people being demoted or not getting a promotion, compromising some of those reward and recognition things that Amy spoke about earlier on before. You can see very quickly that once those thoughts start to enter the mind, the natural response, and welcome to being a human being, is to go, well, I'm going to step back, or I'm going to try and either sugarcoat what that mistake looks like, or not talk about it, or just see if we can get on without, this near miss has happened, well, we just won't talk about it, and nothing happens, and then great, my social position isn't compromised at all through that. The challenge within that is that can very quickly, and it can be a little bit of a runaway carriage here, in terms of once those experiences of people start to enter how they operate, or what their experience of the workplaces look like, it starts to perpetuate itself more and more. Particularly if people can get away with not talking about mistakes, or particularly if people do talk up about mistakes, and this is often the big challenge, is that people will own up to where something goes wrong or something doesn't quite go right, and very, very quickly the response that they received is a threatening response from a social brain perspective, and they'll go through that process, but you can almost bet your bottom dollar that the next time that happens, they're avoiding either that situation where that mistake could happen, or what they're avoiding is talking about what that mistake looks like, or certainly talking about it openly as well. The kicker in all of this is that mistakes are inevitable. As I said, sort of welcome to being a human being, welcome to working in an organisation, is that things are going to go wrong from time to time, and sometimes often, sometimes less often. How leaders react to those mistakes is one of the most critical things that set the organisational culture. And so often we'll do diagnostics with organisations where they'll talk about strengths, and there'll be opportunities that will come through in those results. Where the big challenge exists, though, is that the comfort or the trust of people speaking up when things don't go to plan or things don't go to right is not there. And so the opportunity to address some of those other opportunity areas, or harness those strengths more, is compromised, because there's this element of distrust that exists across the organisation. Where we start to see, and we're seeing this shift, which is really, 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 really exciting, I think, in a lot of industries, is that we're shifting away from trying to attribute blame when things go wrong to more looking at them as learning opportunities. But where that blame does exist, or people feel that their accountability is seen as them being blamed for something, you see that resentment, you see that distrust, you see within information start to get withheld, and a lack of accountability as well, which will often play out where people are reluctant to want to engage in that activity again for fear of things going wrong, or people just not speaking up when they do go wrong. The leader role is really, really critical in this space. It's really, really critical in this space, and we're seeing the process that exists around, incident investigations, or when we're trying to understand near misses and have those conversations in pre-starts, one-on-ones, team meetings. We're seeing the process around those things shift to away from blame. The challenge, though, is that, and this goes for all leaders, and the invitation is that people pick up on emotion really, really quickly. Really, really quickly. And so there's a lot of conscious effort in terms of how we respond. But, for anyone familiar with Paul Ekman's work, is that, we pick up on emotion, in milliseconds. And so how we as leaders are prepared to respond when mistakes do arise is the critical piece, is being comfortable that mistakes are going to happen, and how do we position ourselves to be ready to respond to those mistakes. That fosters the culture of being open. It's, there's a big difference between that initial disappointment, frustration, anger that might only be a very brief second or two, and then going into exploring what could have been done differently or how we learned from it, versus being prepared to jump straight into that conversation. That's a big distinction that's going to set the culture differently as well. So some things we can do differently in this area, make it easy to report, particularly when we're looking at some of those bigger mistakes as well. Is create that process or that culture where it's not about attributing blame. There is an accountability piece, absolutely, but make sure that it's not about attributing blame as the primary motivation through going through those processes. Making sure that we reward and recognise, back to Amy's point, and people demonstrating the things we want to see, those open conversations. We're focusing on continuing improvement. We're helping people, or we're holding people to account, particularly for repeated mistakes. That still is important. That we're holding our systems to account, and we're trying to create a culture where, to my point made a few times in this section, mistakes are going to happen, and it's how do we respond to those each time that they do pop up as well. The kicker in all of this, and for some of you may have seen an article that came out last year, quite a good read in terms of the no blame culture, that says, it's got some traction over the last little while. That could go too far. And that's certainly what this research is alluding to or highlighting and opening up for consideration, that can we go too far where people aren't being held to account in that process as well. So it's something to really look at, and a big part of that is how the leader actually facilitates those conversations, whether an incident investigation or whether it's just a general one-on-one type conversation, is how do we facilitate those conversations where people still are held to account on what they need to do. And there's a whole nother webinar within that, but that people are open to also having the conversation as well. To jump into the next one, I'll hand over to Amy. Just to touch on this last one, also a very important.
Lovely, thanks, Ben. Just also mindful of the time and thinking I might do a bit of a quick run through this one. It connects really well with what we've talked about already in terms of rewarding and recognizing and responding, as Ben was just saying, really with that positive mindset of learning and trying to understand what's going on after an incident has occurred. And that employee input in decision-making is something that did come out in our social experience of safety and the research that we've done in this ebook that's about to be released. And so those top performing organizations are far more likely to have senior leaders spending time out in the field, talking to workers, informally gathering that information about what's going on, what they could be doing better. And as a result, we're seeing employees who are more likely to feel comfortable sharing errors, who are more likely to have that increased trust with their leaders and that sense of fairness about their processes. So a quick poll here on the screen. How well do you think your organization is giving employees the opportunity to have input into decision making? So not at all. Perhaps there's just a little bit of employee satisfaction surveys or engagement surveys, but outside of that, we don't see much. Not great occasionally, but decisions are still made by the people in charge. Asking employees for input, but not getting much engagement or useful input from that process. and fairly well, got good processes in place, do the best to take that input on board, or absolutely excelling. Decisions are made by the lowest possible level. People feel empowered to make those decisions that impacts them and their team. All right. See what we've got as a very quick response for those that answered quickly. Lovely. Okay, so we've got 2% sitting at that not at all, 34% sitting not great. It's not flowing through to the decision makers as often as they'd like. And then the majority of people sitting in that fairly well and asking for input, but not always getting what they're looking for from their people. Really great. Thank you so much for quickly doing that. I know we didn't have a lot of time for people to jump on, so appreciate that. It is a really common thing for organizations to try and do better. And I think this is why we see a lack of opportunities to provide input as being perceived as a threat by our people. They don't feel involved in that decision making. They don't feel trusted to be making these decisions better. And that ignoring of employee feedback or not closing that feedback loop on why a different decision was made is what's breaking down that trust going on into the future. So what we really need to be spending time doing is getting our people involved, and as often as we can, providing that information back to them of what has occurred and why. So we may not always be able to act on the information that they've given us, but if we can give that information back about why it hasn't been solved in the way that they would like, or what you have done to solve it instead, or what you're working on doing, if it's something that's going to take time to solve, it can also be really helpful to acknowledge that and give that information back. One of the questions that came up in the chat, I noticed, and it also came up in our pre-webinar, was how to get more people involved in that input process. So there's a few tips here around conducting problem-solving sessions for doing that. So getting people in with the express purpose of sharing ideas and brainstorming and being really open and positive in that process. And what we want to be doing there is getting a really diverse lot of voices in the room and ensuring that our senior leaders are not jumping in first with their opinion, that they're coming in later in the conversation to share what they think might be going on after they've listened and actively listened and really taken on board the feedback and the problem-solving process. The effort that's involved in using a suggestion box, it's not a stick it on the wall and walk away. That opportunity to give feedback is going to be so important. Getting back, calling out the information that's come in so people know that it's valued, that it's used, that people think about the information that goes in there. And lastly, as Ben was just talking about before, that sense of threat can really come when our leaders have that reaction that makes us feel like we've done something wrong. And that's something that we really want to be working on improving as well. That was a really fast, quick run at the input, but I'll throw over to Ben, who's going to share a little bit about our ebook, and you can pop in your details if you'd like to receive a copy.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amy. And I said at the start, we've got a lot that we want to try and cover off on, and we got through as much as possible. It's a really, really, I think, useful and timely conversation, as particularly as sort of psychosocial is getting legislated. More organisations are looking at the social experience, and I think data like this. Invite all organisations, that the difference between those organisations that really want to make a difference and those organisations that want to be seen to making a difference is how well they look at the data. And so I think data like this, as well as your own data through whatever method that might be generated or provided, is really, really important to look at. What do we need to do to really shift what the experience of work looks like for people? It's such a critical thing that leaders need to be asking themselves every day, all the time, is how well do I understand what the experience of work like is for my team? And the same applies in the safety landscape, certainly, as well. This report will come out very, very shortly, so please respond to the poll just on your screen there, and we'll be able to get you a copy of it. Likewise, as well, we unfortunately didn't get to we picked up on some of the questions coming through, but really any of the questions that were coming through today, there's quite a lot of questions that I think Amy and I could take up your weekend plans with by continuing on going through those questions. They're questions we'd love to discuss. So we might look at those and pick those up in a different forum. But likewise, we would be very open to jumping on a call, to unpack these things, more with people. So if you are interested in jumping on a call with one of us or one of the team, just to flesh this stuff out just a little bit more detail. I think there's such a great opportunity to learn from each other, and likewise, we really enjoy talking to how people are finding this data play out in their workplaces as well. By all means, respond to the next poll that Cassie will put up just now as well. But from Cassie, Amy, and myself, thank you very much for jumping on the call today. It's been great. Feel free to add us on LinkedIn or reach out. And we'd love to jump on a call with anyone here and chat about all things social experience.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ben and Amy. On behalf of Centres, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We look forward to having you join us for our next webinar on the 14th of March. Invites will be coming out next week on unpacking a case study in critical control management of a major mining operation. Until then, stay safe, everybody.